Actually, I haven't seen it. Not good.
Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so last time we focused on the nature of political theory. I argued that political theory forms the foundation of critical citizenship because democracy demands that all of its citizens be critical in relation to government. Democracy demands that we all be, in some sense, political theorists. Last time we focused on Socrates, focused especially on the form of what he was doing, critical citizenship through critical dialogue. We are still working on form this week, and it's fitting because if you have one word to say about Plato, it's form. And we will really begin to hit the ground running next week as far as like substance. You know, there's the standard like form and content distinction, but content will wait for next week. We're still doing form, but we can't move on to Aristotle and our unit on ancient liberty proper without at least taking a passing glance at Plato. For as it's a really famous quote, for as Alfred North Whitehead is often quoted as saying, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. I do not mean the systematic scheme of thought which scholars have doubtfully extracted from his writings. I allude to the wealth of general ideas scattered through them. So that's just a really
Wait, can you explain that really quick for me, please? I don't mean what's the distinction between those two things that you just outlined? Or that quote outlined?
So he's basically, the whole thing's going to be about this. It's like, we're not really concerned about what Plato's saying. It's how he's saying it.
Okay.
And he's sort of laid the groundwork for everything, every novel idea we think we have about politics or about philosophy or epistemology or anything. Plato has made a reference to it and made an attempt to sort of talk eloquently about it.
Okay.
We don't have to buy his answers, but like the first person to ever talk about most anything we have to talk about, Plato is the guy. It's like all of our lives are footnotes to Plato is the idea. So is this working? Are you guys like seeing what my shit's like not working very well. Okay. Are you guys?
I'm not. I can't see. We can't see shit.
I can see a picture of Plato.
Oh, okay. You see a picture of the stone head.
Sorry, I'm a fucking dumbass. Yeah, we can see it. You're good.
Okay, good. For some reason, my computer's not, but that you're looking at the right thing. Okay, so let's be reminded of Plato and his life. Plato was born around 427 and lived to 347 BC. He was born in Athens, founded a school there called the Academy, which is like the first university. The Academy is where Aristotle studied before founding his own school called the Lyceum. Plato's teacher was Socrates, and that Plato followed Socrates around for some time and wrote down many instances of Socrates' life, some of which we read and discussed last week. It's often said that Socrates is the founder of the philosophical tradition. If we're going to say that, then Plato is the founder of the written philosophical tradition. Among the Platonic ideas that are discussed most widely today are the theory of the forms, the image of the dividing line, the ship of state, the allegory of the cave. We also get the sort of language convention of calling something Platonic after the idea of the forms, really. So the perfect version of something is the Platonic version. The convention of calling non-romantic friendships Platonic seems to me to be somewhat of a confusion, but it's likely referring to the account of love described in Plato's the Symposium, in which Plato, through Socrates, describes how sexual desire for a beautiful body becomes sublimated during the course of a romantic relationship into love of beauty itself. So in other words, we learn to love the form of beauty through our most intimate physical relationships. That develops into a sort of more powerful love. And therefore, we are no longer seduced by physical attractions of any particular body. That book's Symposium is one I haven't read, but I want to. Plato was a gymnast, a wrestler. He unified the life of the mind with the pursuit of bodily strength and athletic achievement. Interesting fact about him. So this is just a funny thing. This is the work. This is called Play-Doh. I think it was at the Getty. And so there, there's much we can say about this. Immediately you think of the forms, the theory of the forms. You think of the sort of substance of what Plato has to say. It doesn't really matter what the substance is. It's more about sort of playing with the ideas. We can form Plato into whatever we want. The lasting bits of Plato, the stuff that's really influential, it's not really any universal truths about reality. His thoughts about justice or the perfect republic are not really what stick with us, but rather it's the material that makes up his arguments. That's the sort of fun stuff to play with. This is just an image. I'm including this because I was talking to Maverick and Maddie this week, and they're interested in depicting the life of Socrates in some artistic sense. Before the sort of film, but before the art form of the film, this the story of Socrates' life was depicted in, aside from just the standard Christian images of like Christ's life, Socrates' life is like the one that like gets depicted in art most. So I would advise looking at art from the early modern period. Oh, actually, that was this. That's what this was supposed to be. I was supposed to show you guys this. But so the works that we have are, the works that we have of Plato are listed here according to the commonly accepted interpretations of when each work was written in his life. We know the Apology was a very early work because it's mostly a transcription.
How old was he? Do we know how old he was?
How
maybe?
old Plato
like,
was? Early man.
Yeah.
Early. He was a young man, 20, something like that.
Damn.
It's mostly a transcription of the trial of Socrates, and we know that the transcription was mostly correct. We know like that it just wouldn't make any sense for him not to write it down immediately. And so we know that he wrote it when he was really young. We can see our reading for today, the Republic, comes from his middle period. He's already a grown man by the time he's writing the Republic. He's founded his school. He has many students at this time. He's sort of attempting to consolidate his thinking. And this is the slide I thought I had up when I was talking about artistic forms of the depictions of Socrates' life. It's a very common story that gets depicted all over the place. There might not be film versions of it, but like take a look at, go to the Getty, you'll see Socrates all over the place, So background to Plato's Republic. It's written in Plato's middle period. Like I said, the Peloponnesian War is over when Plato's writing it. Socrates is long dead, but the narrative takes place in the past. So sort of Plato sort of places the narrative 60 years in the past or something like that. While Socrates himself is a younger man. He's depicting Socrates as a young man. It's during the Peloponnesian War, but it's a peacetime, and in the peacetime is sort of interesting. We'll talk about it later. It's so foolish of me to try and spend an hour telling you about the Republic. I'm going to select some brief moments, and by doing so, I'm going to do incredible damage to the entire book because it's a long book. It's 10 books in one, and it's a dialogue. It's dialectic. There's a claim, there's a counterclaim, there's a resolution. We're going to see this sort of dialectic form again in political theory, not in a sort of dialogue sense, but in the historical dialectic of Marx and Hegel. That's going to be an interesting thing we'll talk about. But
is it Eucacus? Wait, the Dancus? What's it called?
Elenchus. Yes,
So,
we will talk about the Elenchus in a second here.
Wait, sorry, Brian, can you just clarify, when you say dialectic, do you mean like the worldview depicted through dialogue?
No, I'm referring to the act of Socrates in all of Plato's writings, seeking truth through a sort of pursuit of, through sort of asking somebody a question, receiving their answer, and then showing that person who just gave him that answer why it's wrong, and then sort of working towards a better answer, sort of going in a back and forth dialogue. This is called a dialectic, where there's like a sort of claim, a counterclaim, a conclusion, or a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And it's that like we can refer to Plato's works as being dialectical in that sense. There's another sense that we use the word dialectical. Marx uses it, Hegel uses it. It's a sense of talking about history as being dialectic, whereas we sort of resolve contradictions in previous forms or previous eras. But I don't want to get into that right now. We should talk about that later. So there's it's a dialogue and it's dialectic, if that makes any sense. It's written as a dialogue, right? So you can read it as a play, as like a sort of with different characters, right? That's what I mean by that. So every introduction to this book.
Thank you.
Yeah, every introduction to this book given in a course like this one, or like an edited volume, if you're reading a book about Plato or something like that, it begins by telling you that we don't really know what the Republic is about. It's difficult to pin down. Nobody has the greatest claim to know what it's about. I'm going to attempt something of the sort right now. The Republic is a book that defies classification. It fits into none of the categories, either modern social studies or modern science. In it, practically every side of Plato's philosophy is touched upon or developed, and its range of subject matter is such that it may be said to deal with the whole of human life. It has to do with the good man and the good life, which for Plato connotated life in a good state, and with the means for knowing what these are and how to obtain them. Hence, the Republic is not a treatise of any sort, nor does it belong to politics or ethics or economics or psychology, though it includes all of these and more, for art and education and philosophy are not excluded. For the breadth of subject matter, which is a little disconcerting to an academically trained reader, several facts account. The mere literary mechanics of the dialogue form which Plato used permitted inclusiveness and freedom of arrangement, which a treatise could not tolerate. So it's kind of more fun to read this than other works that you might read about political theory. Moreover, when Plato wrote, the various sciences mentioned above did not yet have the distinctness that was later somewhat artificially assigned to them. So the lines between psychology and politics weren't as clear as they are, somewhat to us now. More important than either literary or scientific technique is the fact to which reference has already been made, that in the city-state, life itself was not classified and subdivided so much as it is now. Since all of a man's activities were pretty intimately connected with his citizenship, since his religion was the religion of the state and his art was largely a civic art, there could be no very sharp separation of these questions. The good man must be a good citizen. A good man could hardly exist except in a good state. And it would be idle to discuss what was good for the man without considering also what was good for the city. For this reason, an interweaving of psychological and social questions, of ethical and political considerations, was intrinsic to what Plato was trying to do.
Damn, could you kind of break that? So what you're saying is that this dude didn't believe there was a difference between sociology and psychology? Like there wasn't a difference between the few and the many? They hadn't broached that.
Yeah, this isn't really right. This isn't really a claim by Plato. So I'm attributing this to Plato, but only doing this by sort of pointing out that that's kind of what ancient Athens was. That's kind of what the ancient world was. They didn't go around trying to classify everything as this is the realm of sociology. This is the realm of politics. This is philosophy. Oh, that's psychology. You shouldn't be talking about that here. Like they didn't do any of that, And so therefore, it's sort of hard for us to place this book because it's everything, right? I guess that's the claim of what I'm trying to say. The ancients didn't do that, And so therefore Plato isn't as well. So Having said all that, this is a book where Plato advocates for forced re-education of non-compliant citizens, the expulsion of outsiders, a strict hierarchy of who should rule and who should follow. Poets and artists would be strictly controlled and censored so that their art would never inspire anything dangerous. The breaking up the nuclear family, where children would be raised by strangers, where class divisions were set in stone and nobody could hope for any improvement in their lives, where leaders would perpetuate all-encompassing conspiracies such that power would be unthreatened, among other, numerous other outlandish and shocking proposals for how to govern. And yet this work is foundational to both philosophy and political science. Why? Why read such a dangerous and despicable book? Well, let's see. Yep. So beginnings of books are often telling about the author's purpose. Much has been said about how this book begins. Does anybody know how this book begins?
No.
This book begins with a very famous phrase in political theory and in philosophy and literature. A lot of people know the first line of this book. It's sort of said and sort of common. There's a couple things.
Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country.
No.
Oh, got it. Okay.
I will just tell you guys that it begins with this line. It says, I went down to the Piraeus. I'm being sort of funny about this, but this is a very famous line. I went down to the Piraeus.
I went down to the Piraeus?
I went down to the Piraeus. And so I have the map here. This is the Google Maps, and then this is the Assassin's Creed Odyssey map.
Hell yeah, dude.
So Athens.
Do you show the Assassin's Creed one in your classes?
Sure.
Fuck
I
yeah.
actually peek behind the curtain. I haven't taught this before. This was an all new slide deck.
Hell yeah.
So Athens is here. Piraeus is the port town. The port of Piraeus. It's a port town 5 miles away from the Athenian city center. It's more than just a port. It's its own city, right? It's its own sort of thing, but it is the port of Athens. It's the site of Athens' power since Athens was a military might because of its navy. This is where the navy sort of came to port. This is also where Athens empire was sort of like funneled into Athens, right? This is where its sort of international legs were spread, right? You could go down to the port to sort of get a taste of the international world, in the same way, ports in our large sort of metropolitan cities are sort of sites of international wonders and things like that. Going down to the Piraeus is a sort of going down to the other world, right? What is he doing there? He goes down to the Piraeus. He's attending the festival of the Thracian goddess Bendis. Thrace is another city-state in ancient Greece. The festival was thus an opportunity to witness something more international than simply 5 miles away from Athens. He could walk 5 miles and end up in Thrace, is the idea of going down to the Piraeus. It's just something that the port can offer. I went down, right? It's a descent. Maybe a reference to the allegory of the cave, going down to the cave, going down to the lowly commercial zone, out of the high esteem of the sunlit philosophy on Athens. I went down, I did. Socrates is speaking. This is written after the Apology, likely with much more of Plato's mind than Socrates, right? We're not really depicting any event in Socrates' life, although we can sort of assume that it's emblematic of the sorts of things that would happen to Socrates. This takes place in the past during a peacetime in the Peloponnesian War. What does the port represent? Democracy? Plato is famously distrustful of popular government. We will see that. And again, what is he doing down there? He's witnessing a spectacle. He's witnessing a sort of foreign festival. And so this is where, in the Greek, it's called theoria. Going down to the Piraeus to do theoria is like essentially what it was written in Greek. And so this is where we get the word theory from. And what is theoria in Greek means witnessing a spectacle. So the philosophic theorist divorces themselves from the mundane and the repetitive day-to-day life of Athens, and they travel to some faraway land in foreign culture, gazes upon difference, and discerns the divine and the eternal in relief of their own practices. It's a contemplative activity, not a vacation, right? He's not taking a vacation. He's not going to go down to the Piraeus to turn his mind off. The philosopher, the theorist, is a spectator, a witness. So this begins a long line of thinking about politics and the theorist as a visionary, or as visions, or as doing politics through visions or through metaphors of seeing. We often talk about doing theory as doing a sort of vision quest, right? You're like, I'm going to show you my vision for politics. Like we tend to think that way. I went down with Glaucon. So the rest of the line says, I went down to the Piraeus with, Glaucon. Glaucon is Plato's brother. So Plato writes his brother into the narrative here. Glaucon, again with the vision metaphor. Glaucon means it means like gleaming. It means like seeing with so much shaded eyes in the twilight is like kind of what Glaucon means. And so what happens to them? They're on their way back from the Piraeus. They went down to see the festival, and they're on their way back, but they get accosted on their way back. A slave comes up behind them and says, Polemarchus orders you to wait. He is coming up behind you. And Glaucon, who's with Socrates, he turns around and says, well, of course we'll wait. Polemarchus arrives. Polemarchus has sent his slave ahead to tell Socrates to wait. Polemarchus arrives with his group. And we see that in his group is Adeimantus, the Glaucon's brother. So Plato's two brothers are now into the play. And Niceratus, who is the son of Nicias, the general who has just brokered the peace that they are now enjoying with Sparta, which is the famous Peace of Nicias, which is supposed to last 50 years, but only lasted 7. Polemarchus says, stay with us or prove stronger. Stay with us or prove stronger, meaning we intend to fight you unless you remain and chat with us. Could we not persuade you, says Socrates. Not if we won't listen, Polemarchus says. They reach a compromise. We will all go to my father's house, Polemarchus says. My father is Cephalus. His house is nearby. A dinner will be provided. You can return to the festival after. There's going to be a horseback race. It's going to be a wonderful time. Come have dinner with us. And it seems we must stay, says Glaucon. So why does he begin? This is such a strange way to begin a book, isn't it? But already we see the prefigurements of the sort of ground the book's going to cover. Who has the title to rule? Is it strength in numbers? What constitutes truth? If the truth is truth in persuasion? Is the truth simply what the stronger says it is? Is reason debate worthwhile endeavor? What about when your interlocutor refuses to listen? Can democracy, that which claims to express the will of the majority, the will of the greater number, be rendered compatible with the needs of philosophy and the claims to respect only reason and the better argument? Can rule by domination and force be greased sufficiently with seductions of culture, as Polemarchus seems to suggest by offering dinner and promises of viewing a horseback race? All of this is purposeful. Right there on the first page, it seems to be the question of the book already revealed. Can we harmonize the truth with the popular? Is the just city that Socrates will later pursue the combination between force and persuasion? This is something we will have to see. So we arrive in Cephalus's house. Cephalus, the word means head of household, tradition, family, the figure of convention. Cephalus is this sort of remarkably unreflective man. He represents traditional virtue and its capacity to explain itself against the challenges of criticism. He's an aged father, and he returns from prayer. He sort of comes into the threshold where everybody is gathered, and it's sort of a slightly uncomfortable scene. And it's one that we all sort of can are familiar with, right? When there's like an older person that's in the company of a bunch of young people. Oh, how are you? How have you been? I used to know you 20 years ago or something. It's a sort of uncomfortable scene here. But Socrates does something rather abrupt, you would expect the sort of a pleasantries and then hope that Cephalus goes away. But Socrates says, hey, tell me what it's like to be so old. Do you still feel the need for sex? Do you still like to have sex, Cephalus? And Cephalus answers, no, thank God. I've gotten past that part of my life. When I was young, it was all I did. All I did was think about sex and satisfy my bodily desires. Now I'm content, at peace. Those sort of driving forces have left me, and I'm very content with that. Now, in fact, my mind is much more concerned about what comes after life, and making myself ready for that. Which is why I'm doing sacrifices out in the garden, and you've just interrupted me. I want to be a good soul so that I don't go to Hades, right? So I don't go to that other place, he says, and pay the price for injustice done here. Furthermore, when you hear about people complaining, this is all Cephalus telling Socrates. When you hear about people complaining about getting old, it's likely because they've done something wrong in their lives. They are a defective soul and they didn't live correctly. And so being an unjust person it's hard to bear when you're youthful and when you're old. And those that are old and complaining about being old, it's likely that they're unjust. And Socrates, kind of looks around, sees that he's in this like really sort of like exquisite villa. It's a very nice, rich home. And he says, well, Cephalus, I think most people would say something like, you're very rich. That's why you're, content with being old. You're very wealthy. That's why you handle your old age well. They get into an interesting discussion about money and its role in virtue. But Cephalus responds saying like, no, money's useful. Money's really useful for being just, but it's not like a necessary condition, right? Money allows me to pay my debts. It allows me to ensure that I don't owe any sacrifices to any gods. It allows me to not cheat anybody, right? I having money allows it's like it's easier to be just when I have money, when you have money. But it's not like a necessary condition, right? And Socrates sort of picks up on what Cephalus has just said. He says, oh, so justice is speaking truth and paying debts, is it? That's what justice is. It's just sort of like paying debts and not, sort of, lying your way through life. This is the sort of first pass definition of justice we're going to get in the book. There will be numerous others. I'll probably only get to really one more. But the famous reply that Socrates has to Cephalus is, well, if justice is just paying your debts and sort of giving back what was given to you or something like that, then is it just to give back the weapon that your friend let you borrow before he went mad? Your friend has given you a weapon to borrow, and then in the meantime, he has gone mad, right? He's lost his mind. Is it just your definition of justice would say something like, I should give the weapon back to them. It would be compatible with your definition of justice, wouldn't it be? Of course, this is a very ridiculous thing. It doesn't pass muster, right? So we throw this away. Cephalus is sort of embarrassed, and he sort of like slinks out of the room. He says like, well, I have to go get back to my sacrifices. And so like immediately, without really even trying, what Socrates has done is sort of banished tradition. He has banished the sort of like unreflective pursuit of sort of commonplace justice, just commonly just doing what you think is right. And he has banished it from the narrative, never to be heard from again, right? And then, so Cephalus' son, right, we met earlier, Polemarchus, he picks up his father's argument. And instead of just going through the entire book, narrating like this, I think it's important just to move on to some of the important parts. he dispenses with Cephalus's son. Polemarchus gets dispensed with in a similar way. But we turn to a very important figure. We turn to Thrasymachus. So the exchange with Thrasymachus is probably the most famous part of this first book, maybe of the whole Republic. I mean, it's up there with the cave. But Thrasymachus is sort of listening to Socrates sort of annoyingly, dispense with Cephalus, dispense with his son Polemarchus, and they're trying to find out what justice is, right? And Thrasymachus is getting annoyed. He's sort of like in the background, getting held back by people. He's saying things and then having somebody hold his mouth shut. Finally, Thrasymachus, he's sort of described as a wild beast. He's about to spring. He hurls himself towards Socrates as if to tear him to pieces. He roars and snarls. "What nonsense," he says on page 13. "What nonsense you two have been talking all this time. If you really want to know what justice is, don't just ask questions. You know it's easier to ask questions than to answer them. Why don't you give an answer, Socrates, instead of asking everybody else? Why don't you tell us what justice is?" And so Socrates is sort of taken aback. He's scared. He's trembling. He doesn't give way to Thrasymachus. Instead, he flatters him in the sort of usual way. Thrasymachus.
That's how I feel, dude.
I know. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Thrasymachus is in some ways.
Shit.
Thrasymachus is in some ways a sympathetic character, and you'll see even more in a second here. But so Thrasymachus is a traveling sophist. This is like, a very common practice. There's sort of teachers that would sort of travel around Greece, and the rich families would pay for them to come teach their children. Thrasymachus is what we know of him. He's a sort of rhetorician, somewhat of a philosopher, not very famous, but obviously famous enough for Plato to include him in the story. But so he does this sort of thing. It was like, well, I will tell you what I think justice is. Thrasymachus is saying to Socrates, but you have to pay me first. And so all of Socrates' friends pay Thrasymachus. And then finally, Thrasymachus offers his definition of justice, which is a very famous definition. It is, justice is nothing other than what is advantageous for the stronger. What does Thrasymachus mean by this? Socrates himself engages in a lengthy back and forth, attempting to wrestle out of him a more precise definition. But we can proceed.
What's that? Sorry, I just wanted to ask.
Yeah.
This is not the justice conversation. Does Thrasymachus' dad is the one who like put to death all the people? No,
that is
okay.
Euthyphro.
And that happened before the trial.
Right.
The Republic is after the trial. No?
Well, so after the trial, Socrates dies. So Socrates is a young man right now, and it's sort of a story about his life. It's not
made
really
up. This is some made up bullshit.
That's right.
This is an exaggerated story to make a point.
Yep.
He wrote a story about a bunch of dudes talking to each other.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So what does he mean by justice is the advantage of the stronger? It's sort of strange language, but it's a very commonplace understanding of justice, really, for us. It's one that we can recognize. Thrasymachus is offering a relativist or a realist account of justice. It's one we're familiar with because it's the epistemology of the skeptic, the postmodern, the cynical social critic. What he means by advantaging the stronger is that those who are in the position of power get to control what is just, good, evil, bad. Justice and morality are socially constructed, right? They're nothing but the reflections of a particular political community. Ruling as such doesn't necessarily have anything to do with ethics. In fact, those who rule likely do so because they're strong and cruel as opposed to those in their thrall. Right, this is the Thrasymachus idea here. He seems to be taken by the notion that people who commit crimes on a sufficiently grand scale not only get away with them, but are admired. We can think of somebody robbing a convenience store versus like someone robbing a casino, right? Or the famous moment from history is when a pirate is like brought before Alexander the Great and, you know, defends himself by saying, look, you're robbing entire countries. I'm just robbing a ship. And
So
yet
he's
you're the
saying-
one that's great.
Sorry, so he's
Yeah.
saying. He's saying that justice is a lofty ideal for people who don't understand that there is no such thing. And the truth is that justice is just a tool for the powerful to fuck over the weak.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
feel like
Super
I
agree.
feel like
love
this
this is my shit.
I feel like what he's saying on a really simplistic level is like the fucking history books are written by the winners.
Yes. So that's, you know, all part of it. It's even more so than that, Howard. I think it's something like, well, it's funny because it immediately disintegrates under when Socrates asks him to like stake out a particular position. But like the idea is that like there's no such thing, right, about as justice.
But let me ask you something, isn't like his argument, or never mind, you keep going, but I was just gonna say, isn't that argument like in direct contradiction of itself, right? Like because of, you know what I mean? Like that argument is self-disproving. Well, yeah, you keep going.
Yeah, it's there's like a small sliver of a window where like Socrates like immediately like jumps in and like ruins Thrasymachus's life. So
Sorry.
yeah.
One more question. So is Thrasymachus saying justice is a negative thing? Like, oh, there's no such thing as justice, or justice is a tool used by the powerful to like oppress the weak?
Yeah, so these are all sort of like the questions that are sort of revealing of Socrates is like why Socrates is able to defeat him. Like you guys are all bringing up like the sort of like the various planks that like get elaborated in the book. It's kind of interesting. Because Thrasymachus is at once saying two different things. He's saying there's no such thing as justice, right? Like it's just something that we've like made up, and some people are strong and so therefore can like overcome some sort of weak sissy Philistine like adherence to some, you know, some strange doctrine, and then, you know, we are over here strong enough to overcome that, and then we can sort of dominate you by telling you to adhere to it. He's at once saying it doesn't exist, and at the same time saying it's stupid to like go for it, right? And that it's and then you're absolutely right, and that it's like that justice is a vice, right? That doing injustice is actually a good thing. And so those are two separate claims here, and that Socrates sort of like hones in on them and pulls them apart. And I just want to just tell you what I have here. So in the course of the back and forth of Socrates, Socrates forces Thrasymachus to admit that there is some standard of wise rule, that like a good ruler is going to do some sort of like is going to have some sort of knowledge of how to do that. And in fact, Thrasymachus, he's a traveling sophist. He gets paid to go teach, you know, future rulers how to do this. He claims to know this.
Yeah.
And then arguing that this suggests that a standard of justice beyond the advantage of the stronger exists. Furthermore, through the dialectic, Thrasymachus gets backed into a corner where he's forced to defend not only injustice, but ignorance. Since injustice is wise, then justice turns out to be some sort of ignorance. Socrates pulls off this sort of rhetorical trick, which comes back to bite him later when the two brothers ask him to elaborate. But with Thrasymachus, he forces Thrasymachus to argue something like, if injustice pays off, then it is a virtue. And if justice does not pay off, then it is not a virtue. This is not the skeptical position anymore, you know, that there's no such thing as justice. And leaves Thrasymachus open to the challenge that the truly wise would discern that society cannot form under these conditions. the free rider problem, the correct collective action problem, all these things. If everybody acted this way, for example. So the truly wise person would sort of not rule in this way. Thrasymachus realizes finally that he's been defending not only injustice, but tyrannical, unwise, and ignorant injustice. And then this is a very famous part, the blush, right? So Thrasymachus blushes. His cheeks sort of redden, and he becomes very sort of embarrassed, right? He blushes because he's been chastened by Socrates. His provocations haven't held up under interrogation. Whether or not Socrates' line of thinking makes sense, and it doesn't really make sense. It's not really that Socrates sort of like.
Can you like break that down to like in a more in a dumb way? Eli flagged that. Like, why did he win that argument? It seems. Why would you budge?
Socrates like moves Thrasymachus off of his position in a subtle way. I really can't explain it. It's because like we just simply have to move on, and it's not that important, honestly. What's important is that there's Thrasymachus's challenge, or Thrasymachus's definition of justice, that it is the advantage of a stronger, isn't really dispensed with. But Thrasymachus is. Thrasymachus, the sort of like boisterous, angry, you're an idiot, Socrates. He gets sort of like defeated, but the position remains. And so I just want to, tell you that. So whether or not Socrates' line of thinking makes sense, it doesn't really, but it reinforces an earlier assumption that will shape much of the rest of the book. Justice as a form of knowledge. And it firmly anchors the question of justice in the question of personal ethics, rather than in legal or proto-sociological questions. So the question that you guys might have when you hear the word justice, you might think some sort of like legal definition, right? But what's sort of like immediately sort of like delivered to us is that justice is going to be some sort of inner ordering of like the sort of soul. It's important to read the scene of Thrasymachus's blush in a different way. It's more than just a vessel for a set of ideas. He's both a historical figure and a character with his own suite of emotional responses to the interaction he's having with Socrates. His blush should be read as the provocateur's humiliation before reason. No longer can he, beast-like, press his argument because his argument doesn't hold water. The force of his argument has sundered. His failure to press his case against Socrates isn't just intellectual, it's a folly born of ethical unseriousness. His immodesty and boldness cost him his pride in his thought.
So then it's like intentionally like saying like you weren't supposed to take this dude seriously anyways. He was just a provocateur and he's a fucking shit kicker.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And it's more like, if your language has to pass muster, it can't be the force of it, right?
Got it.
It can't be just like because of your like emotionally.
This dude was just fucking trolling this dude and he got fucking owned.
Yeah, exactly. So just to move on, because we don't have a ton of more time. This raises a serious routing of Thrasymachus, but there's there's a crucial crucial question left unanswered. What is justice? We haven't really gotten there yet, right? And it's a question that Adamantius and Glaucon take up in book 2. I've written so much that I don't have time to reach. So Socrates is the Elenchus, as I've talked to Maverick about. The Elenchus is a word that we've used to describe Socrates' method. The word that Socrates uses is midwifery. He calls himself a sort of midwife, that he's going to deliver the truths that sort of exist already within the people that he's talking to. Doxai in this sense is like opinions. So like everybody has opinions, but there is some kernel of truth in everything. And Socrates is going to sort of deliver it from people. Glaucon. So Glaucon picks up the argument from Thrasymachus. Not that he really believes Thrasymachus, but he wants to hear Socrates defend what is justice on its own terms. Don't just tell me what is not injustice, right? Tell me what justice is and why should we pursue it on its own terms. Glaucon offers what we might call the social contract version of justice. This is the quote here: is those who have done and suffered injustice, and those who have tasted both, the ones who lack the power to do it and avoid suffering it, decide that it is profitable to come to an agreement with each other, neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. As a result, they begin to make laws and conventions, and what the law commands, they call it lawful and just. And so this is a social contract version. It's not altogether dissimilar than Thrasymachus, but it's perhaps, more easily digested. We're going to see this idea come back up when we read Hobbes. But in general, justice comes about when people agree upon a certain standard of behavior that overcomes the injustice of a world lacking justice, right? It's a sort of flight from the state of nature into a society. It's the things that it's the conventions we agree to in order to form society. But as Glaucon says, this account of justice is rather burdensome. It must be practiced because of what follows from it, not because it is worthwhile on its own. And he says, people love it not because it is good, not because it is a good thing, but because they are too weak to do injustice with impunity. And so to illustrate this, he tells the story of the myth of Gyges, or the ring of Gyges, which is, it's straight up the Lord of the Rings ring. Like, it's a ring that makes you invisible. And so when Gyges has this ring on, what he does is he seduces the king's wife, he kills the king, he rules the kingdom. And Glaucon says, wouldn't all of us do this, right? Like, justice is not something that we would do if we could get away with doing injustice. Nobody does justice for its own sake. If we can get away with it, we would all do some sort of mix of ethical actions, some just, some unjust, but not because of the ethics underneath, but because those actions advantage us. So why then, Socrates, do we do justice when if the resulting actions won't benefit us? These are some other quotes. I do just want to move on. It's so hard. Yeah, I just have to move on. So sorry. So
dude, that thing, the ring of Gyges, like kind of changed my that was like a really eye-opening moment in my life when I first learned about that, and everybody in the whole class was like, I would be a good guy and I would do this and that, and then I said I would kill and rob, and everyone was like, oh. But then the professor was like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the professor loved that. Yeah,
we're all pieces of shit. That's basically what I got out of that, and it just really changed my perspective on like how powerful other human beings' opinions are.
Like in a classroom setting, like
yeah,
like
no,
like
but
you.
Also the reason I'm not robbing and stealing a lot of the times is because I can't, because I can't, not because it's wrong.
Right. Yeah, it's not. I mean, maybe, right? I don't know. I mean, like it's kind of a shame we can't really talk about this because I want to finish before an hour, and I have just so much to get through. It's stupid. I shouldn't have spent so much time talking about stuff. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That this is a big problem. Like Glaucon brings this up because he wants Socrates to defeat it. Glaucon wants Socrates to tell him why we should act correctly, even if we had the ring, right? Even if there was no threat of retribution. And so Socrates takes up this challenge, right? And he says like, well, I'm having a difficulty explaining to you what justice is, why we should pursue it on its own terms. But what we should do is we should construct a city in speech, which is the famous sort of phrase. So we're going to construct a city in speech. And once we have constructed the city, it's going to be a just city. It's going to be the perfectly just city. We will know what justice is because we can see it in aggregate. We can see it in the grand scale. It is so big because it is over the course of an entire city. Then we will know it by its form, and then we can discern what justice for the individual will be. And so that's a sort of a silly move that he makes, right? It's not really silly, but it's an interesting move. What is the perfect city? What does it look like? Supposedly the reason for he's writing the book, answering what the perfect city looks like, is, I guess, supposedly in a roundabout way, asking what is good for the individual, right? The only reason we're concerned with what's good for the city is because we're concerned with what's good for the individual. But this sets off more than like 2,000 years of questions about political life. Is it the polis, the public, the political body correctly analyzed as or analogized as a person? And so this is the metaphor, the city and the soul, right? There's so much to say about this. The claim that something like the governance of the soul doing justice as an individual is something like governance of the city and doing justice politically. So like consider an example, you know, when we say somebody is typically American or typically British, typically French, we mean that, you know, certain characteristics or behavior are broadly representative of the cross section of their country, right? They exhibit some of those behaviors. Is that a useful way to think? You know, what does it mean to say that an individual can be seen to be magnified in his or her country? That one's country is a collection of characteristics of the individuals that make it up. One way to think of the city and the soul metaphor is a particular kind of causal hypothesis about the formation of individual character in political institutions. This maintains that individuals both shape and determine the character of our societies, and that those societies shape and determine our individual lives. It's one way of making sense of this metaphor. The modern American might produce a certain type of democratic soul, perhaps, or so we can hope. The ancient regime in France might produce a very different type of soul. And so, you know, the remainder of the book, The Republic, seems to be about describing a regime that will produce a particular type of individual, in the same way I just said that the American regime produces a particular type. We are going to construct a just regime which will produce a just soul. And then through that, we will know what justice is. That seems to be the purpose. And we finally arrived there at, you know, at the end of the second book. The rest of the book, except for book 7, which is the allegory of the cave, goes something like this. The origin of society, you know, we find out that individuals are not self-sufficient. We have to live together. So we form society. The just city that we're going to form in speech, the city in speech that we're forming is called Callipolis. Means the just city. And immediately he's very concerned about the defense of the city. We need to have very strong military. And these folks that make up the military are going to be guardians. We're going to call them guardians. And we're going to be very concerned about their education. They have to be educated correctly. What stories are appropriate? What sort of poetry is appropriate? Well, we can't have any poetry that's going to sort of explain the gods or depict the gods as doing injustice, right? All the gods have to be you know, pursuing justice or just for their own sake. And so Homer, Sophocles, all these poets have to go. We're going to train both male and females to do the guardianship. Wives and children are going to be shared. We're going to destruct the nuclear family, and we're going to eliminate private property. Why? Interesting to ask. There's a very interesting part where he talks about the myth of metals. So, right, there's going to be 3 classes, right? There's going to be the sort of the rest of us, all of us, sort of like common rabble, and we are the bronze class. The silver class is the guardians. They are going to be sort of like those that we aspire to be, but obviously cannot. And then the gold is the philosophers. They are the philosopher king will rule. And in order to forget the fact that we have been sort of assigned these classes, we are going to learn, all of us, this myth. We're going to be told a myth that we were born with this element within us, these metals within us. And so the trick that the memories of us learning, you know, going to school and things like that, that was all a myth, or that was all a story that you know, or a mistake. And so this is the myth of metals. It's or the noble lie, right? It's a lie told by the powerful for a noble purpose. And so this is a very famous idea that, like, sometimes those in charge of the state, that sometimes those in power have to sort of lie for a good cause, right? And you know, and the noble lie is a very famous idea. Reason harnesses will to be in control of the appetites. This is what justice looks like. Is that the 3 sort of classes, right? Reason, the philosopher, will control will harness will, the guardians, to be in control of the appetites. And we're the appetites, right? All of us, you know, down here in the rabble. a very interesting passage on 164. How realistic is this? You know, I'm sure this is a question that you guys have. Why are we talking about the just city, the perfectly just city? It can't ever come to be, can it? What's the purpose of us talking about it? Socrates has a whole book talking about this idea that I think frustrates you guys, which is Brian or Socrates or whoever, you're talking about all the like this theoretical thing. Why does it interest you so much? It can never come to be. It's not realistic, right? And what Socrates says, what Plato says through Socrates, is that pursuing the perfect, even in theory, right, is a worthwhile pursuit. It's how we will arrive at better, solutions on the ground here with us.
Progress, not perfection.
Yeah, essentially, it's something like that, right? And furthermore, it's never come to be, and likely never will, until philosophers rule as kings. That's the other famous part, right? Philosophers need to rule as kings in order for us to sort of achieve this type of city. Another famous metaphor, the ship of state, right? We're all sort of in the democratic state. All of us are sort of rowing the ship. And we're all trying to decide who should be navigator or who should be in charge of the ship. And some of us are better at convincing others to allow us to sort of lead the ship. But the one that really knows how to lead the ship is the navigator, who's up in the crow's nest, who can see the stars, right? They can see the sort of they know the patterns in the sky, and so they know how to navigate the ship. And yet everybody down.
Socrates is vying for this scenario.
Well, this is just essentially, right? This is just the sort of like the metaphor that those that actually know how to guide the ship are going to be seen as stargazers and people who are, their heads are in the clouds, right? They don't know what it's like to be down here on the ship. They're looking at the sky. And so it's this sort of metaphor of the ship of state that like what we actually need are the ones that like don't really look like leaders to us.
Yeah, the people's politician.
Yeah. The dividing line, too much to get into, the idea of the forms, whatever. The typology, the genealogy of regimes is really interesting. Essentially, once we have the just city, once we have the perfect city, it won't stay there. It will fall from grace, right? And it's the story of how the sort of just city devolves from justice into oligarchy, into timocracy, into tyranny, into democracy, then tyranny, right? Democracy is the second worst. Democracy is like almost as bad as it can get, right? Because like, who would want the dumbass rabble in charge, right? And furthermore, just to say something about democracy, the abuses that Plato attacked was the ignorance and incompetence of politicians, which is, the special case or curse of democracies. Artisans know their trades. The politicians don't know anything except the ignoble art of pandering to the great beast. That's the only thing they're good at, and so
that shit's true as fuck. Though.
That there's no sense in which that has any connection to like ruling well, right?
My favorite politician is also a very well-respected businessman.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. His name's Donald Trump. Good call. I forgot about that.
Do we have 10 minutes or should I wrap it up in the next?
Dude, you can keep fucking rolling. I'm vibing, but
are you sure?
But I also respect other people.
Rush, man. What's the rush? It's the journey. Okay.
All right. Well, so why don't we watch this? Because the only thing I have left to talk about is the allegory of the cave. Is this even gonna fucking work? This might not even work, bro. I bought a brand new computer and this fucking thing is like already fucked up. Oh God. Is it playing for you guys?
No.
No. The allegory of the cave is.
It's supposed to be a video.
It might be Zoom, man. Might not be a computer. Zoom sucks. Google Meets is a little better.
Well, that's a shame. So anyway, the allegory of the cave is here.
Are we gonna go over the allegory of the cave right now?
Well, that would be the over the next 10 minutes. It's just a video. It's just. Oh, is it playing?
Yeah,
Are you
Not
guys
very
hearing
well.
anything?
no.
Okay.
No, no
Well,
sound.
why don't we just fuck it? It's fine. We could just move on because
That's really fucked up because that's the only thing I don't know. Like I always drop out of the class before.
I'm gonna send. How about I'll just send that video in the text and then
Like everybody gets this cave thing, and I just am left out of the cave.
no, yeah. It's not that difficult. Basically, the idea here, actually, since this is basically the entire thing here. So, down here, the internet users, this is all of us, and we're chained with our arms held back behind us. We're chained to this wall, and we can't move our heads. And all we can see is in front of us. We can see these shadows along the wall, and they're moving back and forth. These sort of shadows along this wall. And the idea here is that this is what life is like. This is what we think life is the shadows. But if we could turn our heads, what we would see is this big long wall behind us. And behind this wall, there's people walking back and forth holding like pikes and sticks that have these figures on top of them. And these figures are casting the shadows that we're looking at, and the shadows are being cast because there's a fire behind them. And so all this is happening inside the cave. And so the idea here is like, if somebody were to break free from their chains and sort of recognize what's happening down here, none of the other people in the chains would tell them to do what they're doing, right? Hey, I just broke free from my chains. And actually, if you look behind you, somebody's like walking back and forth with like stuff, and they're like the things that you think are true are actually just sort of being sort of like presented to you, right? They're being sort of constructed for you to make you think that they're true. And everyone would tell everybody would tell this person to shut up and get back into the chains, right?
Mhm.
But that's not even what's really true, right? Because like if this person were to continue to travel back out of the cave, what they would find is they would be completely blinded by the light of the actual, the sun. They would see the sun for the first time in their lives if they left the cave. They would be completely blinded. They'd have no language to describe what they're looking at. They would have to spend so much time there outside to adjust their eyes, to like learn what's actually true, that once they did come back to the cave to try and tell everybody about the truth and like what's going on outside the cave, they would be sort of labeled a heretic, a sort of crazy person, a lunatic, right? They would be sort of like completely dismissed. That's essentially the allegory of the cave. I will share the video because it's a fun little video. It's narrated by Orson Welles. But what's being constructed here? I find myself unsure how to frame this because I don't really know if this aligns with your guys' systems of beliefs.
Is he saying that what if this entire reality that we're experiencing is fabricated and we're like a head in a jar floating in space making it up? Is that what he's saying?
It's not really like that sort of science fiction-y idea, but it's that idea comes from this, right? But it is something like the things that you think are important, the things that you think are, life is about, is being sort of fed to you, first of all. And even the ones feeding you are sort of like unaware of the truth. There's like a third division of like distance,
right. Like basically like there's all of this, there's all of these politicians kind of telling us one thing or another about gun laws, but the truth is that we shouldn't in nature there are no guns and we shouldn't have any.
Yeah, something like that.
Nice try, dumbass.
Well, so it seems sort of quaint to me. I think that
or like what is he talking about? What's outside, I guess is my question. What's outside?
The truth. So this is the Platonic idea, is that there exists a universal truth. The world of the forms.
There's the justice. There's an intrinsic justice that pervades all things.
Yes. There's the world of the forms. This is the model. So this is the model of the world that ran the Western world for the last 2,000 years or so, right? The Christians picked this up. Like, oh, there's like a truth out there that some have access to, and then when they bring that down to us, we tarnish and tar and feather them, and we banish them from society. The Christians loved this, you know. This was like, oh, perfect, we found our guy. You
Well,
know?
I mean, just simply every single election, there's a bunch of bullshit that literally this is just what every candidate is saying over and over and over again, which is the media is.
Yeah,
The
have you
media
guys ever heard of,
they
dude, have you
are-
guys ever heard of like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez? This like really seems illustrative of a lot of her ideas to me.
So there exists a capital T truth, a universal, a knowable truth that some have access to. The rest of us are down in the muck with no true knowledge. What passes for knowledge is recognizing the patterns on the shadows of the wall being held by the elites. You know, I always have in mind like the stock market. You know, people who are really good
No,
at the
dude,
stock
it's the
market.
media.
Well, sure. Yeah, of course. Like, you know, like you can sort of like ascribe any the beauty of this analogy is how sort of like
Got it. I just saw it clicked. I got you.
how applicable it is to like, you know,
Anything.
yeah,
You're saying-
anything you want to talk about.
Got
right?
it. I got it. It kind
But-
of makes sense why this is a political theory class and you're using this because this was taught in philosophy. I get it now. I get it. This is
But it's interesting you say that because it is sort of anti-political, isn't it? Right. So those who engage in real truth seeking seem to like be above the muck of politics, right? To say nothing of the postmodern critique of this allegory, you know, like, is there a real truth out there? You know, like
Oh,
you
is
know,
there a
No, but
postmodern critique of this?
A good politician will say this over and over and over and over again.
yeah,
There's a
Howard, the
truth out
postmodern
there
critique is
behind
that like we're all in the cave and there's no getting out of it. And
There's no such thing as an
there's no
objective
such thing.
truth.
Yeah, that
Got
would be
it.
the postmodern way to you know.
Isn't
Well,
that
isn't
like
that-
pretty?
isn't that
Isn't
kinda
that
what
pretty
that dude said?
nihilistic though, Brian?
I don't know. I
Uh,
feel like that's what that dude said 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, I agree.
it's a that's with Thrasymachus, sure.
Yeah. Thrasymachus, my dude.
But so let me just sort of give the sort of boring like pro politics criticism of this, which is like always given. So Socrates presents the quandary of the philosopher, who on first read seems to have reached access to the good and true, and returns to the cave in order to cajole his fellow citizens to the way of truth. But the philosopher fails because the people in the cave think the philosopher has lost any ability to perceive the state of the world between them. You know, the philosopher can't win the game of shadows. He doesn't know which shadow is going to come next. He hasn't been watching closely enough. How could he tell us anything? But as we read as we read the allegory, you know, a million times, we begin to wonder if the philosopher's claim to knowledge through reason is just as much of a political move as dismissing him, right? So this move,
Right.
you know,
How do we know that he's not just another?
yes, that's exactly right. There's no evidence, right? That, you know, this move that my approach is most reasonable, most true, most expert,
what I was
most
saying.
knowledgeable,
Yeah.
is the one that closes off any future dispute over about what should be done, right? It's a ruse because it only requires the claim. There is no evidence that could be submitted in the political sphere that is most reasonable, true, or knowledgeable. Thrasymachus seems to be shut down by Logos in the beginning of the book, when the philosopher claims to be able to shut down all political discussion,
Yes,
while
not
the
yet, buddy.
philosopher, you know, but it's the same move. You know, the philosopher claims to be able to shut down all political discussion in the cave. The failure of the philosopher in this chapter is often read as a defense of Socrates, who was executed by the Athenians. But what if the problem is not so much the polis, but the philosopher who tries to rule the polis by claiming to be capable of being outside of it? The Athenians would ostracize those who distinguish themselves too greatly. And, you know, maybe they were right to do so, right? Demanding and expecting reasonableness to defeat those who think that power alone should dominate seems naive. It would seem to be so naive that it leads to the destruction of that place in which people suppose that by reason they could consider and debate together. It defeats the whole purpose. By invoking reason to foreclose the political debate is also dominating through power. this is also a power
Yeah.
move. It's also a domination through power to sort of take this sort of claim to knowledge and bring it down to the cave. Viewing reason within political discourse as the best resistance against those who wish to foreclose reason is naive. So is hoping that some knowledge that just transcends political life can dissolve those disputes. So the only reason I say all that is just because that's like, you know, everyone has a writes their you know, sophomore paper about that, right? And so it's just a way of saying Plato gives us all of this, right? You know, Plato sort of like lays out all this groundwork, and we can sort of disagree with him, but the reason why he's great is because the ground that he sort of lays for us is like we can like tread for like the rest of our lives, right?
Right.
Much of the typical Platonic dialogue.
What did he think?
Well, he offers this idea of the philosopher king, right? That there is a truth. We should sort of find those that have the most knowledge, you know, that have access to the truth, and
But
then
wait,
ask
isn't he
them.
simultaneously saying like, but believing a politician is just, he brings up the counter argument to his own.
No, that
or
was
is that someone else?
Saying all that stuff was the sort of critique of the Plato's cave. That's the sort of political, like, democratic critique of the anti-democratic Plato, right?
Who's saying this? Who
I
brings
just
up
said
the
all that.
critique?
Well,
Is it in
everybody
the Republic,
does.
though? Is it in the Republic?
No,
though?
it's not. It's not.
Okay, that was my question.
Sorry if I didn't make that clear. Like,
No,
everybody.
it's fine. It's important because it makes
Yeah.
it clear to me that Socrates was the first politician, and we're all just sitting here acknowledging that. He's saying he should be king. No?
Well, so that's the interesting part. Is that
he's
like
showing he's out here showing us the pikemen, and we're like, oh, okay, there is a truth. You know, guns should be allowed.
Mhm.
You know, whatever.
Plato says that the real philosopher, the one that's actually has access to the truth, will want nothing to do with leading. With ruling.
Okay, he does say that.
Yeah,
but
like
is he alluding to the fact that that's him? Like, is this a power move from Plato?
Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, so you're speaking the language of Nietzsche. You know, sort of seeing the sort of political moves within a move that says something like, we're not going to do politics here or something like that, right?
Okay.
But yeah, but I'm just, the only reason I brought up that lengthy critique is to just say that, like, people talk shit on Plato all the time, and that's good and that's fine. And I think Plato's open to all sorts of critique, but he sort of is the dude to talk shit on and talk about and talk with, and, you know, like, he just set it all up for us. You know, it's not really, it just doesn't make sense to not talk about Plato.
I think he knows. I think he knows that when he wrote it. Surely,
You have to say
right?
sitting.
Maybe not. I don't know. I haven't read it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, no, he's not. So you're asking, like, what is behind his pen? Like, what is he up to? He thinks that, like, he's trying to bring about a more just world, right? And he's trying to say we should force the philosophers to rule. And yeah, you might say, like, you know, he's like trying to be humble and say, like, somebody should tell me to rule and make me do it. And I'll pretend like I don't want to do it, but, like, really I do. Maybe that's going on, you know. I think that'd be a fun thing to argue. But, like, that's like really what he's up to. He's trying to tell.
Yeah, he's like the philosopher should be, the true philosopher will want nothing to do with leading. They're like, well, will you lead us, Plato?
Yeah.
And he's like, no, it can't be me.
Yeah,
I'm a true philosopher.
make me. You'd have to make me do it, and then, like, you know, he's like imagining them making.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe that'd be kind of a funny thing to do.
can see by
What you
the
were
story of it.
describing earlier, with, you know, the gold, bronze, and all that,
Yeah,
reminded me of the book The Giver. You know,
I don't know
where
that.
everyone kind of has their assigned
Classic slapper.
duties, and people are, you know, coexisting in this just beautiful,
Yeah,
you know, like society where everything's perfect
That
except
sounds exactly like Plato, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what ends up happening? Is it like does it like not go right?
well,
Oh, dude,
this society
it's
is
great.
like in black and white, right?
But
So
they don't know that. They don't know it's black and white.
right. Right. And so
It's,
there's
oh
this
wow, that's crazy, and it's literally the cave. That book is the
Yeah.
allegory of the cave. Wow.
so
And
the
the
giver is
myth
the
of
only one
metals.
that can see in color and has like notions of like what violence is and what like all these other like
Emotion.
negative things. Yeah, yeah. And so
Oh,
this society is like sheltered from all of this suffering
mhm.
and they just live these perfect like utopian lives. But anyway, we should watch the movie
Yeah.
if you don't want to read the book.
And that sounds exactly, they must have wrote that narrative about or with the Republic in mind, because the myth of the metals is, very instrumental, right? We have to lie to these people or else they're not going to accept the fact that some of them we just randomly chose to be guardians and some of them we randomly chose to be, the common people. Yeah, that's great.
Another book, Red Rising, also does that. They directly lifted
Oh yeah,
all of
I read that. You let me borrow that once. So yeah, I mean we could just end right there. He was brilliant at identifying the tough questions. Whether or not he answered them sufficiently, probably not, but like he sort of identified the sort of ground that we all walk. He keeps eluding us. He's frank and straightforward and yet slippery. He's just an interesting guy, I really like Plato. I think he's interesting. But next week we are going to read a very short piece, much shorter than this. It will be less than an hour, and it's going to sort of give us the sort of outline for the rest of the folks that we're going to talk about. It's a French Swiss political theorist named Benjamin Constant, and he wrote this little thing called Liberty of the Ancients Compared with That of the Moderns, and it's going to be great. Anyways,
Thank you, Brian.
Yep, thank you guys. That was a lot of fun. I skipped some stuff, but I got through most of it, so that's good.
Do you
Gonna
have like a
stop recording now.
timeline here you gotta stick to or something? What's the
Maybe
why